Welcome back, everyone, to a slightly different kind of reaction video today. We're not going to be reacting to a specific video from another content creator, but rather we're going to be taking a look at a series of videos from history. Tonight is a presidential debate between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. And it's one that in a race that seems to be tightening and fairly close and could go either way, it's a debate that could have major consequences, as we've already seen earlier this year, the consequences of a presidential debate that resulted in a change of candidate. So anything can happen, and we might look back on tonight and think that it was the moment that decided this race one way or the other. And there have been some rather historic moments in both presidential and vice presidential debates over the last 60 or so years since televised debates first became a thing. So I thought it would be interesting just to look at some of those moments from past debates. And I'll offer some commentary, some context, and just some analysis about why these moments mattered or why we remember them, even if they didn't necessarily have a direct impact on the outcome of the race. So join me as we do that. Let's dive in. This first one we're going to look at is one of the most well-known moments in a presidential debate. This is 1984. You've got Walter Mondale, who is a former vice president from Minnesota, going up against the incumbent president, Ronald Reagan, who at this time is the oldest president in American history. And so there were a lot of serious questions about whether he was up to the job. And of course, it's interesting now in hindsight because Joe Biden was 5 years older than Reagan was at this point when he first took office as president a few years ago. And if Donald Trump were to win this year, he would be even older than that. So interesting to see how Ronald Reagan handles this. Ronald Reagan is known as the great communicator. Of course, he was an actor before he went into politics. And he not only handles this question well, but he deflects it, and he not only gets the moderator laughing, but he also gets his opponent laughing. And it completely took this issue off the table after this.
And with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis, is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Look at Mondale. Look at Mondale. Now, I don't think that this had any bearing on the outcome of the election. This was a landslide victory, and Reagan came within a few thousand votes of winning all 50 states. Mondale won his home state of Minnesota, but just barely. So I think Reagan was going to win this election anyway. But this is a classic example of taking something that was being talked about in the media and it was being made an issue and completely neutralizing it in one statement. This was well prepared. Whoever came up with this on his campaign staff, it was brilliant. We're going to go now to an election from 8 years earlier. This is 1976. This is where you have Gerald Ford, who is the incumbent president, but has never been in an election for vice president or president. So he's never been on one of these debates on the national stage. He was the first person to become vice president under the new constitutional amendment that provided for a nomination process for a new vice president after Spiro Agnew resigns. And then he becomes president after Richard Nixon resigns. And so now he's in a fight for his first election. I don't want to say re-election because he hasn't been elected before. But he wants to run for his own term, and he's running against Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, who is a fairly young guy, and there hasn't been a whole lot for people to go on from either one of these guys, and so this is kind of both of them coming out on the national stage and people really having an opportunity to weigh one against the other, and Ford makes a huge blunder in this debate by coming across as though he doesn't understand the geopolitical situation in Europe. And he basically denies that the Soviet Union has a domination over the political systems of these Eastern European nations that are clearly dominated by the Soviet Union at this point. I want to show you the beginning of this clip where he initially answers the question, and then we're going to take a look at the follow-up and where it went from there, where he kind of doubles down on all of this.
There's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side...
And this is great as well by this moderator. I don't know his name, but he follows up on this question as a good journalist would do. Oh, wait, did I hear you right? And he gives him a chance to clarify it, and he doubles down.
Side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with...
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I visited Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to make certain that the people of those countries understood that the President of the United States and the people of the United States are dedicated to their independence, their autonomy, and their freedom.
Governor Carter, have your response.
Look at him smiling. He knows he's got this thing locked up at this point.
Well, in the first place, I'm not criticizing His Holiness the Pope. I was talking about Mr. Ford. The fact is that secrecy has surrounded the decisions made by the Ford administration.
So this was always going to be an uphill battle for Ford. He pardons Nixon when he comes to office, and that was seen very poorly by a lot of people, even though I think he was motivated by the right reasons for wanting to do that. And in the aftermath of all of the scandals with Agnew and Nixon, it was always going to be an uphill battle for Ford, but it was a total unnecessary, unforced error on his part to do that. So this next one, I'm not going to look at a specific moment, but I just want to talk about the debate as a whole and then just show a clip from it. This is the 1960 presidential debate. It's the first one ever televised, and it kind of sets the standard for what came in the future. But what you have here is you have the incumbent senator one of the incumbent senators from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, who, if elected, would be the youngest president ever elected at this point. He was not quite as young as Theodore Roosevelt when Roosevelt became president, but that was because of an assassination. And then you have Richard Nixon, who is the incumbent vice president of the United States, who, when he became vice president 8 years earlier, was the second youngest vice president in American history, only to John C. Breckinridge. And so they're both fairly young guys, big contrast to what we're dealing with in the last few elections here. But what ended up happening in this election, what everybody remembers, is that Kennedy looked fresh and young, and you know, he's running to be a president from a new generation. You're coming off of 8 years of Eisenhower, and before that you had Truman and you had Roosevelt, who were all born in the 19th century, and now you've got this young guy who's both of these guys are World War II veterans, but they were young when they were in World War II. And what people remember about this is that Kennedy came across looking young and fresh, and Nixon was like, people could see his sweat on TV, and he didn't look as comfortable. And there were some people who have said that people who listened on the radio thought Nixon won the debate, and people who watched on TV thought Kennedy won. But there are a lot of other factors and a lot of other reasons why that might have been the case, like demographics, not just because of what they saw. But let's just watch a little bit of it.
$1 billion extra in tax revenue. Whatever is brought in, I think that we can finance essential programs within a balanced budget if business remains orderly.
Yes, I think what Mr. Noblin's referring to was not one of Senator Kennedy's speeches, but the Democratic platform, which did mention cutting the national debt.
Which is interesting. You know, look at how civil these guys are. And if you watch this whole debate, and the whole thing is available to watch on YouTube, incredible amount of civility that goes on between these two opponents.
I think, too, that it should be pointed out that Of course, it is not possible, particularly under the proposals that Senator Kennedy has advocated, either to cut the national debt or to reduce taxes. As a matter of fact, it will be necessary to raise taxes. As Senator Kennedy points out, that as far as his one proposal is concerned, the one for medical care for the aged, that would be financed out of Social Security. That, however, is raising taxes for those who pay Social Security. He points out that he would make pay-as-you-go be the basis for our natural resources development. For our natural resources development, which I also support incidentally, however, whenever you and appropriate money for one of these...
And you can just kind of see that Nixon's not quite as comfortable on his feet as Kennedy comes across. And if you watch the entire debate, you kind of see more of that. Kennedy's just slicker on TV, and he was much more natural in this medium than Nixon was. Here's a famous moment from a vice presidential debate that people talk about. Dan Quail, I believe, would end up being like the third youngest vice president in history. He's just slightly older than Nixon was when Nixon became vice president. This is 1988. Of course, this is an election that Quail will be elected vice president. And he's talking to Lloyd Benson, who is significantly older and has a lot more experience. And they have this moment where Quail compares himself to John F. Kennedy. Dan Quail is a senator at this point, and he's young like Kennedy was, and he's making that connection. And I think Benson came in prepared for that and had this zinger ready to go.
Follow up on Brett Hume's question when you said that it was a hypothetical situation. It is, sir, after all, the reason that we're here tonight, because you are running not just for vice president. And if you cite the experience that you had in Congress, surely you must have some plan in mind about what you would do if it fell to you to become president of the United States, as it has to so many vice presidents just in the last 25 years or so.
Let me try to answer the question one more time. I think this is the fourth time that I've had this question. And I think that 3 times that I've had this question, and I'll try to answer it again for you as clearly as I can. Because the question you're asking is, what kind of qualifications does Dan Quail have to be president? What kind of qualifications do I have, and what would I do in this kind of a...
It's a common debate technique to, instead of answering the question that you're asked, answer the question you wish they had asked. And you'll see that happen all the time. And it's very frustrating for those of us who are watching that they seem to be avoiding the question, but they all do it.
Situation. And what would I do in this situation? I would make sure that the people in the cabinet and the people and the advisors to the president are called in, and I'll talk to them, and I'll work with them. And I will know them on a first-hand basis, because as vice president, I'll sit on the National Security Council. And I'll know them on a first-hand basis because I'm going to be coordinating the drug effort. I'll know them on a first-hand basis because Vice President George Bush is going to recreate the Space Council, and I'll be in charge of that. I will have day-to-day activities with all the people in government. And then, if that unfortunate situation happens, if that situation, which would be very tragic, happens, I will be prepared to carry out the responsibilities of the presidency of the United States of America. And I will be prepared to do that. I will be prepared not only because of my service in the Congress, but because of my ability to communicate and to lead. It is not just age, it's accomplishments, it's experience. I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of vice president of this country.
Now, if it had stopped right there, that was a pretty solid answer to the question. It's a pretty solid way to frame the debate about his youth and relative inexperience. But that's not what anybody remembers. Nobody remembers any of what he said, only the last part.
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
And you can see Lloyd Benson just light up because he was ready for that. He was ready for that mention to get dropped because that's where he hits him with his zinger.
I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson?
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That is literally the only thing anybody remembers from that debate, is that line. And that shows you how these debates can get framed. It's not necessarily about the substance of the debate and all the things you might say and all the preparation you did. If all people remember is that moment. The same thing with Ronald Reagan with the age quote. That's the only thing anybody ever talks about from that 1984 debate. In 1976 with Gerald Ford, all anybody talks about is there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. One moment can change it all. So this next one we're going to look at is from 1988 as well. You have Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis against incumbent Vice President George H.W. Bush. And, it's not all that common that after 8 years of a sitting president that his vice president then gets elected after him. It hasn't happened that many times in history. And so it was no sure thing that Bush is going to win this election. But a big deal was made, and one of the things that was going on during this campaign was Dukakis had a particular policy when it dealt with crime that had kind of backfired on him. There was a guy who got furloughed who committed some really violent crimes under Dukakis' watch, and that was something that got advertised a lot. And so the very beginning of this debate, I think some people might argue, rightly so, that this was a bit of a gotcha question to start the debate with. But Bernard Shaw, I think from CNN, hits Dukakis with this. And what people remember about this is, you see it says all the emotion. It's Dukakis' lack of emotion in answering what most people thought should have been a very emotional question. I think it was a little unfair to hit him with this question the way that they did, but I mean, is there anything that's fair in presidential politics?
We will be questioning the candidates following a format designed and agreed to by representatives of the two campaigns. However, there are no restrictions on the questions that my colleagues and I can ask this evening, and the candidates have no prior knowledge of our questions. By agreement between the candidates, the first question goes to Governor Dukakis. You have 2 minutes to respond. Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America. But we have work to do in this nation. We have work to do to fight a real war, not a phony war against drugs, and that's something that I want to lead, something we haven't had over the course of the past many years, even though the vice president has been, at least allegedly, in charge of that war. We have much to do to step up that war, to double the number of drug enforcement agents, to fight both here and abroad, to work with our neighbors in this hemisphere, and I want to call a hemispheric summit just as soon after the 20th of January as possible.
So on the surface, it seems like a perfectly acceptable answer from someone who opposes the death penalty. But what people remember about that is they just hit you with a question about a family member being murdered. And you just went right into your spiel about it not being a deterrent. And people said he had no emotion. Now, was that fair? Is that necessarily a bad thing, that a person can stick to the issues and not get clouded by emotion? Well, sometimes it doesn't matter what is fair or what people think should be. It's only what people come away with it. And if you can make them feel a certain way about you, then that's all that people really remember in those moments. And they'll end up going back to Bush and giving him a chance to answer. And he talks about, listen, there are certain really heinous crimes, and crimes, say, murdering a police officer, that I think should get the death penalty. And people came away thinking that Bush really won that argument in that case. And in particular, the lack of emotion on Dukakis' part really hurt him in this moment. So this next one we're going to look at is from 1992 vice presidential debate. And this is a three-way debate. You've got the incumbent vice president, Dan Quail. You have Senator Al Gore, who is the nominee for vice president on the Democratic ticket with Bill Clinton. And then you have Admiral James Stockdale, who's a legit American hero, who's running as Ross Perot's running mate, as this third-party candidate. And this is the moment everybody remembers from this 92 debate. And it got parodied a lot on Saturday Night Live, which is when you know you've really made it in pop culture, when they make fun of you. And he's addressing the fact that nobody really knows who he is because he's not a politician.
Who am I? Why am I here? I'm not a politician. Everybody knows that. So don't expect me to use the language of the Washington Insider. 37 years in the Navy, and only one of them up there in Washington. And now I'm an academic.
So the unfortunate thing in this case is that Stockdale gets spun by this as being aloof and kind of not really with it, not engaged, maybe not real smart. And that was unfortunate and not reality, but debates are not reality. They're what people spin as reality. They're snapshots. Just like that snapshot of Vice President Nixon in 1960. It told a story about a person. It wasn't the complete story, but it was the only story that got told. And I want to give you another really good example of that from the presidential debate from this same year. So this is the presidential debate between Bush, Clinton, and Ross Perot. And this isn't even about what is answered. This is a body language thing. And there's a wide shot that's showing all three candidates. And in this moment, you see George H.W. Bush check his watch. And this is what people remember from this debate more than anything that was said.
We have a question right here.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Nobody remembers that question or the answer to that question. All they remember is George H.W. Bush standing up and looking at his watch before the debate question was given. The body language stuff is really, really important. And I'll give you another example that also got widely parodied on Saturday Night Live. This is from the 2000 presidential election and a debate between George W. Bush, who's governor of Texas, and Vice President Al Gore. It's a really close election. Again, after 8 years of an incumbent president, his vice president is running to take over the office. And what everybody remembers about this is Al Gore very strangely, and there were a lot of things Gore did not do well in these debates. People don't remember the substance so much as Gore's kind of changing persona. He was very much on the attack in the first debate. The second debate, he's like agreeing with everything. But in this particular debate, Bush is answering a question, and watch what Gore does while Bush is answering the question, and watch how Bush handles it.
That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can. All right.
What about it's I don't know what Gore was thinking to stand up and walk over and kind of invade Bush's space while he was answering that question. Nobody remembers the substance of the debate. They remember Gore walking over and invading his space and Bush looking over and be like, and then turning back to answer the question. It was a moment that it was an unforced error on Gore's part to do that. All right, so what do you think about all of that? Is there one that you remember that I didn't mention? Is there one in history that should be mentioned that wasn't talked about in here? Let me know in the comment section below. And be watching the debate tonight to see if there's one of those moments that could make or break this election. You never know what it might be. Thanks for watching.